Firstly, we're participants from many different parts of the world at this webinar, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging all the First Peoples here today and pay my respects to them and to their forebears. We honour your wisdom and your stewardship of traditional lands and seas and your customs by which you enrich us all. It's my privilege to introduce our three panel members, all of whom are heroes of the National Regulator Committee of Practice, as well as excelling in their demanding jobs. Firstly, Rose Webb. Now, Rose has been the Deputy Secretary, Better Regulation Division and Commissioner for New South Wales Fair Trading since November 2017. And she's the sponsor of our New South Wales chapter of the National Regulator Committee of Practice. She has a wealth of Australian and international experience in the regulatory space at both Commonwealth and state level and across a range of domains, including competition and the environment. But she now leads an extensive array of New South Wales regulators, including fair trading, safe work, liquor and gaming, while other regulators in the portfolio of her ministers include IPART and greyhound racing. So a pretty diverse range of regulatory spheres there. Secondly, Simon Cohen. So prior to moving to New South Wales to take up his current role, Simon Cohen was the Deputy Secretary Regulation and the Director of Consumer Affairs at the then Victorian Department of Justice and Regulation. Now, he was my predecessor as the Chair of the National Regulator Committee of Practice National Committee. Not everyone may know that Simon means born to volunteer. Simon has a long and distinguished career in complaints investigation and dispute resolution, as well as regulating on behalf of consumers. And last but not least, it's Tracy McKay. Tracy is the newest member of the New South Wales Chapter Committee of the National Regulator Committee of Practice, and she is the CEO of New South Wales EPA, the largest environmental regulator in Australia. She's worked in all three tiers of government in Australia and in the not-for-profit sector, and brings to our discussion today experience ranging across town planning, housing, education, emergency management, immigration, and human and social services. So a very broad range of experience from all three of our panel members. So before we get cracking with our three panel members, we're going to do a SlidePoll. So here's the first poll question. So we're trying to get a sense of how much each of the participants in today's webinar has to interact with other regulators. So could you answer whether your regulator needs to share information and coordination and collaboration with other regulators? Never. You're a regulator that can operate as a one-man band or one-person band. Rarely, 1 or 2 times a year. Occasionally, more than twice a year, but less than weekly. Frequently, so at least weekly. You're constantly in contact with a regulatory counterpart. Or finally, not all the time, but with a shifting cast of other players. So if people would like to go on to Slido and enter one of those. It's pleasing to see that we've got no one who answers that they never interact with other regulators, because if somebody answered that, you'd be wondering why they attended this particular webinar. Given that most of the participants in this, I suppose you'll be interested in how regulators work together. So I've got about 96, nearly 100. What this is showing is that, not surprisingly, a little over half of you are frequently, that's at least weekly, engaging with other regulators. So that might be sharing information, it might be coordinating, sharing intelligence, or it might be collaborating with them in designing a strategy to address a particular issue. Now, about a quarter of you less than occasionally, so that's more than a couple of times a year, but less than weekly. Interestingly, 14%, so it's not all the time, but with a shifting cast of other players, and rarely 1 or 2 times a year. So for the vast majority of you, for more than half of you, there's pretty regular interaction with other regulators. And our panel members will have lots of insights, I'm sure, about the challenges of and the opportunities of working with other regulators. So we've got about 150 odd, well, 140 responses. So what we might do now, Mark, is move across to the second poll. Now with this poll, we're asking you what your thinking is on how we can achieve more effective collaboration between other regulators. So this one, you can indicate more than one if you wish. If you can tick all of the boxes that you think apply in your particular circumstance. So interestingly, ensuring legislation supports information sharing is is high up the list. I don't know, we'll be interested to hear from the speaker, from our panel members, as to what extent legislation has been a barrier. I know in my previous life I worked at the Victorian Work Cover Authority, which is the workers' comp insurer, and there were really challenging constraints on how we could share information with our counterparts or other regulators within Victoria. And I know in my current role, we've got the ability, sometimes we have to issue sort of mandatory information requests on fellow regulators to manage the issues around the existing legislation. So ongoing relationships is obviously very high. So we've got about 130 of you have responded to that. So I think it'll be interesting to get some reflections on that as we go through the discussion today. But clearly, none of those issues are trivial. All of them are important, and building ongoing relationships between regulators and within and between jurisdictions has interestingly come up top, which from the perspective of the National Regulator Community of Practice is pretty good news, because that's what we're all about. What our sessions are, our webinars, our face-to-face sessions, our information sharing is about trying to build those relationships between regulators within and across jurisdictions. So I think now we might move to the discussion part of the day, the session. So we'll move away from the polls. And the first question, first sort of comment I'm keen to talk to is Rose. I wonder if you could, you're responsible department, which has got a very wide array of regulators within the department and also as agencies that you oversee. To what extent has the need to overcome the barriers perceived or real in collaborating around these complex issues been the impetus for creating that new department, and how are you making it work in practice?
Thanks, Simon. So as Simon mentioned, the Better Regulation Division in New South Wales covers off quite a bunch of regulators. Broadly speaking, they're meant to be regulators that are interacting with the business community. I think that's the sort of common theme behind them all. But in addition to fair trading and safe work and liquor and gaming and racing, which are our big three, we've got a whole bunch of other little ones, like little but important, I should say, very quickly, like the Professional Standards Authority, the Long Service Corporation, what's called Subsidence Advisory that looks after sinkholes in coal mining districts, the Office of the Registrar General that regulates our land titles register. Now it's been sold. So we do have quite a range of different regulators. Safe Work and Fair Trading have been together in the one division for about 3 years now, but Liquor and Gaming and Racing joined by Machinery of Government last year, and the others have joined over that period of time. And I guess the idea was that there is great opportunity to collaborate between all these regulators, so why not put them all together? But it hasn't been without its challenges to make that happen. And it was interesting that the SlidePoll brought up legislation as a big one, because even though we're all in the one department, in the one division, they all report to me, we still face a lot of issues with sharing information and data, because obviously a lot of regulatory statutes are written in terms of the regulator can acquire information for a specific purpose, but that purpose only. We're in the throes at the moment of signing an information sharing agreement between Fair Trading and Safe Work, and I'm assuming I'll have to sign both sides of it. I'm not quite sure how that will work, but that just shows you the extent to which it can go. Because we're really seeing that that's a powerful thing that we can use. We've done a lot of work. People will probably be aware that we've had a bit of a crisis in our building regulation in New South Wales due to a few incidents, and we've got a new building commissioner who's doing a lot of work, and he came in and said, well, of course, you know, when the Safe Work inspector goes out, they should also be keeping a lookout for whether the builder seems to know what they're doing and has proper plans and has proper signage, and likewise, when one of the building inspectors goes out, they should have a check to see that safety is being looked after. And it was sort of a little bit confounding to him, coming in as an outsider, that it wasn't instantly available for them to share that information, even though they were on the same work site and looking at the same building. We've done a lot of work in the last year about a single view of building, including not just our regulators, but also people like our fire brigade who does the fire safety checks, and other regulators, putting it all together in one data platform, adding the overlay of Commonwealth information such as the ASIC records and things like that, and then coming up with what we're calling a single view of building and having various outputs. And that's been a really great example of where having a sort of sufficient mass, the critical mass of regulators in one group, so we sort of kicked it off. We've now been able to get other regulators across the whole of the New South Wales government and even the Commonwealth to add their data in for a particular purpose. So I do think there's sort of opportunities to collaborate, but it does take a while. The other challenges we found is different cultures. Very much are sort of in the liquor and gaming space, a little bit of their culture is industry support, and that's probably not well, sort of fits in well with the culture of some of the other regulators, where they're very much a regulator and industry support hasn't been part of their function. We've had a whole lot of issues about just the way people work, even doing very similar things, but long-grained sort of ideas about how you, how you write up a notice or serve a notice, how you issue a penalty infringement notice, what you tell people that you're dealing with on the way through, who it should be who reviews the decision of an inspector. We had one model in Safe Work where they were very independent reviews of inspector notices, and a model in fair trading where it was considered that someone with a bit of expertise in the area should be reviewing the notice, but then that was getting sort of issues about independence of review were coming in, and we've sort of managed to bring both models together in one review team, and that's been really good to just cross-fertilise, the benefits of expertise with the benefits of independence. We have done a big reorganisation now where we've taken all the different regulators and put them into functional streams. So we've got all our policy people across all our policy areas in one stream. We've got what we call our community engagement people. So they're our stakeholder engagement, complaints management, our research arm. We had various sort of testing facilities and things like the training for responsible service of alcohol. All of that's in one stream. Everything that's licensing, and we've come to the view that a lot of people were calling things permitting, authorising, certificating, but they're all licensing. We've called them all licensing and put them all together in one stream. We've got people who do the initial compliance, inspection, dispute resolution all in one stream, and then the final stream we've got is our investigations and enforcement team. We've had to, of course, put some of, like our intelligence team sits in that investigation enforcement stream because it had to sit somewhere, but it works across the business. And I think a big trick of our realignment has been working out where do we need to keep the independence and expertise of the particular regulators up front. So obviously someone who is a safe work expert can't be going out checking a pub on Saturday night, but where are the common things that we can bring together? So things like reviewing people's work, capability building, stakeholder engagement, we're starting to bring that together a lot more. And we do see more collaboration. I think there's been a few, light bulb moments for people where they've gone, really, you do that? That's exactly what I do. Can we talk and can we share our knowledge? And it might not be the particular regulation, but the way of working that it's been really useful for. And I think the more we can sort of do that within our division and the more we can sort of spread that to our other regulators that we collaborate with, the better.
Fantastic. It seems a big challenge, particularly when you've got cultural matters. You can do a restructure sort of reasonably quickly, but changing culture is a much longer process. Particularly
because in some bits of the business, people have, had a lifetime working in a particular agency, and for them, the culture of suddenly being a small bit in a big pond has been quite challenging, but overall seems to be working okay.
Fantastic. Tracy, I wonder if you'd be able to reflect on your experience sort of breaking down barriers within a regulator. Rose was talking about the sort of functional groups that changes there, and I just wondered if I think you've got some experience on this challenge.
It's a good question, Simon. I guess Rose and I have had the opportunity, particularly of late, to catch up, and what was interesting is we were both progressing very similar transformations for very, I think, quite a different genesis to those transformations, but equally heading down the same path. around what's the functional approach that is going to work to really instill collaboration across our organisations and more broadly in terms of who else they work with, looking in terms of both other regulators and other parts of government and how that works together. So quite a similar path to Rose in terms of the alignment and the structure that we've put in place. And in fact, I think we had 3 teams that were pretty much exactly the same in our divisional structures. But also similar in that, you know, as a regulator, you get people that are very expert in the work that they do and have been there for a long time. So you get this really ingrained culture that exists. And what we're asking people to do is actually kind of look above the parapet and think about what could be in terms of contemporary regulation. And the way we've encompassed that in the EPA is to really call out that we do want to do a transformation. We want to be a world-class regulator, and that requires a lot of work. So we're thinking about what our learning mindset is. How can we be more outcomes focused rather than just counting the outputs of what we do? How are we going to be more responsive and adaptive given the external operating environment? And certainly we feel the pressure in the environment space, which is, it's always very visible what we do. It's highly political, and it's something that the community have an ever increasing interest in. So our capacity to be service oriented, which is, you know, in the past, service and customer has kind of been not the right language, and people have really shied away from that in regulation, but we have to take that on board. We have to think about what our service orientation is. And I guess last of all, really thinking about holding close our purpose. So regardless of, I don't quite have the disparate array of regulators that Rose has, but certainly we've got 14 different pieces of legislation in our space. And there's a lot of crossover between what we do in terms of regulating across those different legislative arrangements. So thinking about how we do that in a real collaborative way that is purpose driven, what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and remembering that our staff in regulation are our biggest asset. So how do we focus on staff and put people at the centre of our decision making as we go forward with the transformation, while acknowledging, as Rose did, that you know, that there is certainly some hesitation from some people about this change that we're going through as a regulator and where that might head us to. So that's probably what I would add from an EPA point of view. Is actually, I might just add one more thing. Just in terms of the kinds of collaboration you can get when you move into that functional space. Things like being able to put together a regulatory strategy that outlines, this is our approach, our risk-based approach, and here's how we're going to play it out, to compliance, to monitoring, to anything that we do in the reg space. We've also done things like established a hub for the first time, which only became operational for us a couple of weeks, in the last week. And that's about triaging everything that comes in. So rather than the urgent and high priority things kind of taking precedent over everything else, really triaging and thinking about, well, who else can actually respond to some of those things that aren't as urgent and important. So that's quite a new way for us to operate. And even sharing data within. So we might have a number of different relationships to one particular site. We might license it under one act. We might actually be pursuing a particular arrangement under a different act, and we might be looking at certain powers under another act. But bringing that all together so that our staff are aware of everything that's going on, or if there's trends across a particular industry. So starting to do that sharing of information in a much more active way to position us to be proactive rather than waiting for something to happen. And I think that's the real danger as regulators. It can become you know, so overwhelming with everything that's coming in the door that you only do the reactive approach. But we really need to get into a space where, as regulators, we've got that full continuum of powers available to us. And a big part of that is how we influence what's happening. So if we can influence before something really happens, that is absolutely the best place for us to be.
Great, thank you, Tracy. Simon, influencing before things happen. You've worked in the consumer protection area for a long while. That's an area where there's 2 Commonwealth regulators at least, and 8 state and territory regulators, all administering the same law. I wonder if you're able to, if you were starting from scratch, how would you create that to foster the most effective collaboration across regulators in that sphere?
Simon, thank you for the question, and g'day to everybody who's joined in today. I think I would reflect that the consumer law has been one of the success stories of coordination and collaboration, and some of the key themes that I'll draw out really reflect some of the areas identified in the SlidePoll polling and in the discussions of Rose and Tracy. But I think a real cornerstone has been a single law that has been adopted by all jurisdictions. And I know when I was working at the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, at the commencement of a single national law suddenly meant that we didn't have to deal with 8 different jurisdictional frameworks when we were considering consumer issues from a dispute resolution perspective. And those immediate business and community and consumer benefits of a single law became very, very quickly apparent, in particular where the law is one that strikes the right balance and where it's got a really strong evidence basis that sits behind it. But equally important, particularly from a longevity perspective, is to make sure that the right governance arrangements are in place. Now, I think they do start with regular ministerial meetings and preferably a single ministerial council to which work can regularly report, and that can really drive the reforms and new laws that are necessary to make sure that that framework stays up to date. In addition, regulators themselves need effective forums at all levels. Regularly senior officers meeting and discussing things on strategy and overarching collaboration arrangements. But as important are the working groups that are done every day by those who work within the regulators to do some of the very practical things around national communication campaigns or around national enforcement and compliance activities that might be undertaken in the most cost-efficient and effective ways. Added to that are arrangements that enable those joined-up approaches to assess regulatory issues. So ways of sharing intelligence and data to inform regulatory priorities, common frameworks to assess when a regulatory action will be taken in response to a transgression, and align cultures between the regulators so that there's a consistent regulatory experience for both consumers and businesses across different jurisdictions. And I guess finally, a strong monitoring and evaluation framework, I think, is really important. That might include regular surveys of those who are impacted on by a national framework. It might also include making sure that you're continually assessing those laws against what's happening in other jurisdictions to make sure that they're properly benchmarked and to ensure that there's a firm evidence base that keeps the framework up to date and fit for purpose. I guess just a couple of other observations I would have. The first is that in a federal framework, it remains critically important that each jurisdiction has the flexibility to respond to issues that are important to it. Because where a jurisdictional regulator is dependent upon decisions at another level that directly impact upon its community, this can reduce confidence in the overarching framework to meet community expectations. And I think there's nothing more frustrating for a minister to hear from a senior bureaucrat that they're unable to respond to something because an arrangement gives that responsibility to another regulator. And I think that flexibility is absolutely critical to the overall coherence and acceptance of the scheme. And I think the second matter is that in such a framework, there needs to be a shared commitment across jurisdictions to apply resources appropriately, because nothing can undermine confidence in the system between regulators when perceptions come that particular regulators aren't pulling their weight because they're not properly resourced to do so. And I guess just a final reflection is that my experience is working as part of an effective federated regulatory model with one law has been far simpler than finding effective ways to work together where there are multiple specialist regulators all engaged in a single field. Or alternatively, where there are both multiple specialist regulators and a generalist regulator, such as a consumer regulator. Rose spoke to the idea of a single view, and that can be often very, very difficult to establish, particularly where those regulators sit outside a single organisational structure. And the types of operational, cultural and governance arrangements that promote effective coordination and collaboration may be less likely to be found, particularly if the engagement is sporadic, if regulators have different agendas, if they have different capabilities, or if they've got a strong incentive, I suppose, to vacate the space and try and point to other regulators who might do the heavy lifting in that space.
Lots of challenges there. I mean, the competition, the consumer law has been in place for quite some time, and I think is sort of seen as as a successful approach to adopting a sort of national approach using the various state and territory and Commonwealth regulators. Tracy, you've had some experience prior to the EPA working where there's a national arrangement but state-based regulators as well. Do you want to share some insights from that?
Sure. So I did work in the early childhood education space, and just like Simon's been talking about, it is a federated model. So there's a national law, which gives it an interesting complexion. There's not many national laws, and it really does help to ensure that whatever happens is in everyone's best interests, and it's also in everyone's best interests to collaborate, because otherwise things don't happen. So it has those two-pronged, I guess, objects that are really helpful. Certainly what I observed in the space was a really high level of cooperation around implementation, and even reviewing the law as the review timeframes came around. So it certainly provided an opportunity for every jurisdiction to take on different aspects of the National Quality Framework and the national law, and really become quite specialist and quite knowledgeable in those areas and share that with others, but which was quite an efficiency when you've got such a significant arrangement. But it also meant that there was a strong level of commitment to come to the table, to have robust discussions and to work through what have been some pretty critical issues. Certainly I wasn't aware when I took on the role in early childhood, the array of challenging partners that were delivering early childhood across the nation at that point in time. So there was some real work to do in the space of, have we got the settings right? Have we got the right mechanisms in place? And it wasn't the same. So the other thing around the national law is you get that consistency of approach in terms of what the law sets out, and then you're able at a jurisdictional level to think about the local circumstances. So although, for example, there was significant fraud in family daycare, the fraud in family daycare was actually quite a different complexion in Victoria than it was in New South Wales. So although we had the same legal framework to operate within, in fact, what needed to happen on the ground to operationalise and meet that challenge was quite different. Just on the, I guess, the broader challenges of federalism, though, I think it's really about the commitment piece. So if you've got a national law arrangement, if one party steps away from that, it makes it incredibly challenging for the others to go forward, particularly if that component is about funding. So if one of the key planks of putting it in place disappears, it certainly becomes quite a fragile arrangement in a regulatory sense. But I would say that, to end on a more of a positive note, I think that most of all what that national law arrangement did was allow regulation in early childhood to take a very long-term focus. So there was surety for the sector, there was surety for regulators, there was surety for government. And I feel like we don't always have that in many spaces, but that national arrangement really did allow for that long-term view to be the focus of what was happening.
Interesting, Tracy. I imagine when you took on the early childhood education, you wouldn't have thought fraud and organised crime was going to be one of the challenges to regulate. I remember when the legislation was going through, there were lots of heated debates about child carer ratios, etc. But organised crime, I don't remember, was at the front of the topics there. So quite a challenging area of regulation. Rose, I wonder if we could move on to a topic of a pretty topical at the moment, which is the flexibility, how you get the flexibility through these sort of cooperative arrangements, particularly in a challenging situation such as dealing with COVID-19. I wonder if you're able to give any examples of how that's confronted you with challenges and opportunities in your expansive role.
Sure, and I'll talk to it at both sort of the national level, following on from what Simon and Tracy have spoken, and also the local level. So it's been really instructive to me about how robust the national arrangements have actually been during this time. In the consumer space, as Simon mentioned, we've got the sort of national regulators and the jurisdictional regulators and the one law. There were immediate sort of issues that came up in COVID, particularly say in the travel sector, with a whole lot of people wanting refunds and not getting refunds, and dealing with other issues that arose. And pretty quickly, the arrangement that we had in place, all the working groups decided that we needed to form what we called a crisis working group. They've been meeting every week ever since COVID began, with all the jurisdictions joining in and just talking about common problems that they're seeing for consumers in their jurisdiction. And some really good arrangements have been made that the ACCC would take over dealing with some of the national travel providers, and then the local jurisdictions could deal with local travel agents. And that's worked extremely well in terms of just coming to a common position on, what our attitude would be to interpreting the law in particular circumstances. Been a great, not just an information exchange, but an actual operational model for how they've worked together. That's been excellent. In the work health and safety side, where the jurisdictions have a harmonised law, but then the Commonwealth body is just is there but doesn't actually do operational work, that's been more about joining up the guidance that we've given to industry. We suddenly found that every jurisdiction was being asked by employers as to what they should do to make sure their workplaces were COVID safe, and we all started down the track of writing our own guidance, but pretty quickly found that the best model would be to have some national guidance and all share that. And particularly spectacular turnaround times. I think usually this guidance takes a long time to settle, with every jurisdiction wanting to do their little bit of editing and everything, but we needed to do it fast, and it's been amazing how quickly some agreement's been reached. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's got it out there, and I think that's worked really well. And then in the liquor and gaming space, where there isn't a national law, but we all deal with the same issues, that's been more a bit of a collaboration around just bouncing off each other about what we're doing in our jurisdictions. Obviously, Simon, you and your colleagues in Melbourne are probably in a different space to us in terms of having pubs open and casinos open and things like that. So we've just been sharing notes on how we're dealing with the various public health requirements in those sort of venues. It's actually also been, I think, a bit of a good I found it quite a good sort of just to have someone to bounce off some ideas at the different levels. So even if we just, we've had, sort of regular get-togethers on video meetings every week, and just to be able to just compare notes on how we're dealing with our health ministries and things like that have been really great. And so it hasn't been a sort of very formal collaboration in that liquor and gaming space, but it's just been ideal to be able to sort of say we're dealing with common problems. And as the various jurisdictions came out of various forms of lockdown, how they'd been dealing with it and finding out that information. So I think it's actually been a spectacular example of collaboration across a whole lot of different schemes. Locally in New South Wales, we had the situation where once the public health orders allowed pubs and clubs to open again, there was a very deep concern about making sure that people were complying with those public health orders, and quite quickly our health ministry wanted to get our liquor and gaming inspectors to be able to work under the Public Health Act, and so that happened. But then we were finding that they were very stretched in their ability to go out and see many venues. And so we quickly got together with both our local councils, but we also had the luxury of saying, we've got fair trading and safe work here, they're sitting next to each other. We could authorise all the inspectors there, even though it's a slightly different job for them. The work health and safety inspectors were used to doing sort of safety inspections. Fair trading inspectors, it's a whole new world to them, going and checking out a restaurant, but they've really all come to the party. We've got together with our food authority, which is not in our division, but we've sort of joined up with them, and have really been able to schedule the inspections, work out what the priorities are and what we should be looking at, getting the data every week for our crisis cabinet meeting on what inspections we're seeing, and doing the enforcement sort of jointly, all exercising a power under the Public Health Act that none of us had before. And that's been an interesting development working with our health colleagues as well, because traditionally they've been a bit sort of careful with their powers, but also careful with their data. And because we've had to share, that's been a great example of collaboration. And I think just has shown the power of having the access to a range of people with that great inspector and regulatory experience who've been able to pivot really fast and done this, which everyone sort of sees being very much in the public interest. So I think out of COVID has come some great examples. And I guess the other thing we've done is we've had to relax some of our regulatory requirements in terms of, requiring strata bodies to hold meetings in person, or requiring people to have a witness present when they sign. And again, in New South Wales, we're definitely looking at opportunities to leverage off all that experience.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting coming out of this as to which of the relaxations are decided to be kept. For example, in Victoria, where we can't go to pubs, and I'm not going to go on about that, but takeaway food places are now providing takeaway alcohol, and it'd be interesting to see whether that continues post-COVID. So it is interesting. There's a whole array of areas where more flexibility has been introduced, and whether or not we bring it back afterwards or it retains. I think we sort of probably should jump across to some of the Slido questions now, if that's okay. One of the top question we've got here is, how do we keep MOUs between regulators as living important documents and not pieces of paper that are worked on and then ignored? Simon, I don't know if you'd be able to answer that. You would have had a lot of MOUs, I imagine, consumer affairs, not just with other consumer affairs regulators, but also with regulators in other spheres. Simon, did you want to respond to that one? How do you, well, are MOUs worth having, and how do you make them as useful as possible?
It's a fascinating question, Simon, and there are as many views on MOUs as there are MOUs themselves, I think. I think MOUs, or whatever they might be, the frameworks that provide ways for organisations to work together are important. But what's really got to sit behind them is the commitment at all levels of the organisation to actually find the best ways and the most practical ways to work together. I think hearing Rose's discussion today, I imagine that there's been a whole lot done in the COVID space that hasn't had MOU sitting behind it. And in fact, those arrangements, if they're too rigid, are probably likely to get in the way of the most effective ways of working together. One of the things I think that also sits behind this for me is the issue of trust. And I think it's a really critical currency in the relationship between organisations, that they have trust in the way that they can work together, the way that they will share information, a shared regulatory intention. Those sorts of things, I think, promote the most effective relationship. So MOUs, yep, there can be important documents, but I think it's actually what sits behind them that's most critical.
Thanks, Simon. I think that goes back to your earlier comments about the role of governance in terms of working groups and at all levels within organisations, collaborating across regulators as a way to build that trust, sharing insights, etc. Rose, did you want to have add anything to that, given you're preparing an MOU between yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, they're important just from the point of view of having a little bit of governance around how people share information. Particularly, I think if you have a particular legislative scheme that has some complicated arrangements within it about what you can do with information you get and what you can't. So it's good to have that clarity. But I think the question's a really good one about people forgetting that they exist and starting to operate outside them. So I guess from my point of view, the more flexible and the less rigid the MOU can be to start with, and the more a sort of statement of intention to work together and trust each other, and sort of principles-based MOUs, I think are much better than those ones that have very rigid sort of procedural requirements in them, because they're the ones that people forget to follow, and then you get in trouble because not only have you done something wrong with information, you've also not followed your own internal requirements. So I think as a statement of an intention to work together, they're probably good, but I'm not sure. I'm with Simon. It really depends on what lies underneath them.
Much more important, yeah. Okay. Another popular question we've got on the slide, it's directed to you, Rose, but I think, Tracy, you'll have some insights into it as well, is there a risk of watering down the expertise of some of your regulatory staff? The similarities may be limited to processes and not technical expertise. And I think this is what the sort of the concern about the universal soldier sort of perspective on regulators, that inspectors who are work safe inspectors will have different expertise to liquor and gaming. Did you want to talk about how you balance out that critical need to retain specialist expertise, but with the imperative to be flexible? Perhaps Rose, you could kick that off.
Sure. Look, I think you face that even within a regulator, let alone in a sort of body like ours, where we've got many regulators, because there is a need for expertise. I know, you know, within, say, our Safe Work Inspectorate, then we've got people who have expertise in psychosocial issues, and people who are engineers who can go out to a construction site. So you're always going to have varying degrees of expertise. I think it's just a sort of balancing act of understanding the need for that expertise, valuing that expertise, and respecting people who do have it. And for some people, that expertise is where they want to go with their career, and they'll get deeper and deeper expertise over time, and you should sort of encourage that and nourish it. But for other people, being a regulator is more to do, you know, with their interest in how regulation as a whole works, and you see people moving between different regulators, as I think all of us have done, and moving between different regulatory schemes, and that's also a really valid career path as well. So it's probably a little bit of both. I think the danger is that universal soldier idea. I think expecting one person to be doing all of it at the same time over the course of a career, they can move, but I think people need to focus on, you know, particular types of regulation at a particular time, but the more understanding they have of other regulatory schemes and how other regulators work, all to the better.
That's very interesting. I think it's obviously very context specific. Thinking at the moment, I wouldn't like our Chief Health Officer, which is a critical regulatory role, to have been the WorkSafe, come from WorkSafe or the EPA. I'm quite pleased that they've typically come through that specialist area, but obviously different areas it applies. Tracy, did you want to add anything to that in terms of your experience about how you balance out that expertise in a particular technical area versus expertise in regulation?
Simon, I think you've hit the nail on the head with that balance that you've just alluded to. So it is that balance between having the expertise, but also the craft of being a regulator. And that craft of being a regulator goes across all aspects of our work. And I think we've got to find a way of having that balance in place, which can often mean exposing people to different scenarios and giving them an opportunity to grow. So you can still be an absolute expert in a particular theme or activity or area of expertise, but you're giving that that staff member and that team an opportunity to grow beyond, which will enrich whatever expertise they already brought to the table. It's certainly been quite an active conversation as we've transformed the EPA, and we're still very much embarking on that. And we've done a couple of things to really call that out. I think, first of all, being really clear about the basis upon which we were going forward with a functional approach to what we were doing, which was about that balance between expertise and the regulatory craft. Second of all, we particularly put in place a couple of teams which span all of, if you like, the themes around what we do. So what are the areas of expertise? And they're the teams, a bit like Rose's research area, that are looking at, you know, what's emerging science in the space, or what's the new engineering that we need to know about, what are the trends, you know, what are the major incidents that are happening that we can learn from, and share that across the organisation. So instead of everyone having to do that for themselves, we're saying actually that's a really important part of us as an organisation. And there's a few other things, but I guess the other major thing that really comes front of mind for me is that putting people first. So we've invested quite a lot thinking about how we can better support the journey of our staff throughout the organisation. So not everyone's going to want to climb the ladder in terms of leadership. Other people are going to want to get deeper expertise. Other people are going to want to broaden their expertise. So really starting to map out what are the different pathways as a regulator, because I think it was Rose and Simon, you might have mentioned it as well. You know, we often have significant numbers of staff in regulatory authorities that have been in those spaces for a very long time. And what we want to do is make sure that coming with fresh eyes every day, which means, you know, making sure that we've got the right supports around them as a staff member and exposing them to new things and different ways of thinking, while building on and holding tight to that expertise that they bring to the table.
Interesting. Look, there's a question which is sort of related to this, and I'll throw it to Rose if that's okay. It's in the Slido. How can different regulators check on compliance with regulations they don't administer and don't have the expertise to assess, which is sort of the same thing. And I think you mentioned earlier, Rose, the challenge about in the liquor and gaming space, using people from outside that area to start doing some of the compliance work. Are there any tips you can do about how to assist people do that?
Yeah, so definitely we had to do some quick training of our inspectors to be able to go and administer the public health audits and know what they were looking for. I think the COVID situation was probably a little bit novel because it was pretty new to everyone, including, you know, people over in our public health areas of our Ministry of Health, about what was a COVID safe workplace, what were the constituent parts of a COVID safe plan. So we tried to keep it as straightforward as possible, identify, you know, some key things that they should be looking for and some key issues that might arise, do some quick training, make sure we had really good supports back in the office for them, so that if they found themselves in a situation where they weren't quite sure what the right response was, they could do something. We did institute an arrangement where they wouldn't issue a penalty infringement notice straight away on the spot, that we have a back in the office check of that. So just to make sure, because people were using it in a situation where they probably weren't that familiar with it. But I think also just, you know, continually learning as issues arose. So we've got a very good sort of operational working group and a steering committee, and they've been joined in that committee by people from our comms teams to make sure that the communications we were sending out to people were consistent with what the inspectors were saying and what we were doing. But it has been a bit of a challenge, so it's interesting. And similarly with that issue about the building that I was mentioning, that we were asking the building inspectors to check a few other things for safety. We've done very simple checklists and dashboards and just said, just check, do they have the sign that says people must wear hard hats and boots? Just check, you know, just check a few key things and report that back. Don't try and turn yourself into a work health and safety inspector, but just keep your eye out for a couple of the key indicators as to whether this is a safe workplace, even though you're out there checking the sewage pipe or whatever your expertise is as a plumbing inspector. So I think it's not overreaching, but just using the ability of people you know, who have a skill as an inspector to keep their eyes open and find a few key things, and then having some good systems in place around it all.
Okay, thanks, Rose. Simon, I'll just throw to you if you don't mind. I've got a question here about the role of education and prevention rather than enforcement. And I think that's particularly interesting in the context of you've had in your career been in complaints bodies in a couple of roles, as well as being in the regulator. Be interested in your view about the role of education and prevention working with in a complaints function and relative to that of the regulator.
I suppose the beginning point for me in answering that question is that I don't see education as a non-regulatory activity. I see it as part of a kind of a holistic approach to how you actually undertake regulation. You have clear rules, you provide good information to the regulated community and to those who benefit from the regulations about those rules. You have appropriate systems in place to then enforce those rules, and you have good processes in place to continue to look at the system that's there to make sure it remains fit for purpose. And indeed, many regulators have as a key regulatory activity, and reflects Rose's comment before in relation to COVID-19, that communication and education piece is a really key element. But I think one of the things that dispute resolution bodies bring, particularly where they are not integrated within the regulator, and you see that in a lot of the utility spaces, so telecommunications, energy and water at the moment in New South Wales in the workers' compensation space, is they bring the stories as they happen and as they impact on those who are supposed to benefit from the regulatory arrangements, whether it's matters that relate to preventing impacts from financial hardship, or that relate to guarantees that are given in respect of service or whatever it might be. And those stories, I think, can be really key inputs to then inform how you actually both educate the regulated community about the impacts of their approaches to doing their business on those who are supposed to benefit from the regulations, and also I think to really inform the regulator itself about where it might put its effort. And my view is that data, the data of the stories that you see from anybody in the community about the adverse impacts from the way businesses or regulations are affecting them, are as important as the data sets that go with them and speak of some of the key trends that you might see as well.
Fantastic. Look, I think that's really important insights there. I know as working in an essential services regulator, we've got a close relationship with the Ombudsman in the energy and water space, and that really, is very complementary. It's very powerful, and as you say, lots of the human impact of the regulation is very clear. Look, we'll need to finish up now. The time has flown, and I must apologise if there's a lot of Slido questions we haven't got to, but some really good questions there. You'll also see recordings and slides from previous webinars, and we've been delighted to see how many people are viewing them. As I said, hundreds and hundreds of people are going on to the YouTube and looking at previous webinars. You'll get an evaluation survey will be sent out shortly, and it'd be really helpful if you could fill that in and give us any suggestions on how we can improve. And for your diaries, we've got 4 more webinars or 4 more events coming forward. On the 13th of October, we've got defining and measuring our public value. Very big response to that, so a lot of interest in that topic. I presume anyone who's done any of the ANZOG courses or EF program will be very interested in that concept of public value. There's a facilitated conversation about regulatory laggards. There's a few places still available for that. We've had one of those facilitated conversations. We got really positive feedback from that, from the people who were able to attend. So really keen for you, more people to sign up for that. And Malcolm Sparrow is doing a free webinar on the 27th of October. Malcolm's released a new book, and as part of his book tour, he's going to be appearing on an ANZOG webinar, which is fantastic, as many of you will be know he's a great speaker. And then on the 17th of November, we're getting organisations to behave with Femke de Vries and from the Netherlands, and she spoke at one of the NRCOP forums a couple of years ago. Great speaker, really interesting person, and Will Day from the ATO. So that'll be opening up soon. So we've got a great set of sessions ahead of us. You'll also be getting the APO newsletter with all of the material that the APO has been collecting in that regulatory database. And there's lots of stuff happening in New Zealand as well that we'll be able to tell you about shortly, because we're working more closely with GREG there. So stay safe, and ANZOG and NRCOP looking forward to hearing you participate, having you participate in one of the upcoming webinars soon. So thank you again to our 3 speakers. That was really interesting and insightful, and stay safe.